Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Heebie Jeebies TV. Now, if you're new here, my name is Ashley, and on this channel, we like to talk about true crime, the paranormal, unsolved mysteries, and anything that would give you the heebie jeebies. Now, before we get into today's case, I want to take a moment to remind you to please consider commenting, liking, and subscribing. It really does help me grow here on YouTube. A quick disclaimer before we get into the story as well. All of this information is public knowledge. All of this information was also found all over the internet, and this video is just me putting that together in an entertainment format for everyone. Alright, so with that being said, today's case is actually going to be quite a famous story. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this story. And if you haven't heard about this story, I'm fairly certain that you've seen pictures of this missing person. And it's actually the story that started the trend, or not trend, but started putting missing children's pictures on milk cartons. And that is the story of Johnny Gosch. Now, as I started looking into this story, as I started looking into it more and more, I was completely shocked, and it was just one crazy turn after the other, and it's probably one of the craziest cases that I've come across recently. So this case actually takes us back to 1982 in Des Moines, Iowa, where Johnny Gosch was only 12 years old, and he had actually just gotten his first job as the neighborhood paperboy. This was a very common job at the time. A lot of kids his age had this as their first job. I even had a job like this when I was very young. It gives you a sense of responsibility, a little bit of independence, and it's a good way to just start earning a few dollars to spend, right? But before we go into his actual disappearance, I think it's important for us to go back a few weeks before the day he disappeared. In the weeks leading up to Johnny's disappearance, including the night before he disappeared, his family home kept getting very strange phone calls in the middle of the night. The night before Johnny disappeared, of course, the phone call came in, and it was around 1 a.m., and it was actually Johnny's dad who answered the phone. And his mom, Noreen, actually overheard him picking up when he first heard the phone call. He picked up, and all she could hear was him saying, "Yes, all right," several times, and then he hung up. So, of course, after hearing this, she goes and asks him who it was. He said that it was just a wrong number, and that was that. Now, because Johnny was only 12 years old, he would still be accompanied by his dad on his newspaper routes. He was getting to that age where he wanted more independence, but his parents still wanted to keep an eye on him, so his dad would always go with him every morning. However, on this day of September 5th, 1982, it was the first time Johnny actually went to deliver the newspapers alone. He left early that morning, and he actually did take the family pet, which was a mini dachshund, and he was last seen wearing a white sweatshirt that said Kim's Academy on the back, with warm-up pants, blue rubber flip-flops, a yellow paper bag, and his little red wagon that he used to carry all the newspapers. So later that morning, around 7:45 a.m., Noreen was actually woken up by a consistent number of phone calls coming in. Like, they were numerous. I think she said there were about dozens of phone calls coming in. And so she goes to pick up the phone. If someone's calling her house that much, there must be something wrong. So she goes, she answers the phone, and it's basically the entire neighborhood asking her why they haven't gotten their morning newspaper yet. So at first she thought that maybe Johnny had just overslept, or that he had forgotten that he was supposed to deliver newspapers that day. So initially she didn't quite freak out. So she went to go check on him, but then she noticed that he wasn't in his room. So she goes and she tells her husband, Johnny's father, and he kind of just initially brushed it off. He probably thought that Johnny got distracted Maybe he was running behind. Maybe he ran into some of his other newspaper friends and was just, distracted. But he did say that he would go look for him. And while they were doing that, Noreen did notice that his red wagon and the dog were gone. So she had safely assumed that he had indeed actually gone out to do his job that day, that maybe her husband was right and that he was just distracted that morning. However, later that morning, John comes back to the house completely freaked out, telling Noreen that he had found Johnny's red wagon and the dog tied up to the wagon, with the wagon pretty much full of newspapers, but Johnny was nowhere to be found. So immediately, obviously, they called the police, but something weird happened here. It took the police 45 minutes to even arrive to their house. And the weird thing here is that the police station was only 10 blocks away from the Gosch family home. Now, a small note here, and we'll get into this a lot more in detail later on, but it's important to note that after Johnny's father had found his red wagon, he actually decided to finish delivering the newspapers himself. Now, a lot of people found this to be quite odd and very suspicious behavior, because if you were to find out that your son was missing, most people would agree that the initial reaction would not be to continue finishing the job. Most people would not think to finish delivering all of the newspapers, but we'll get into that later. So while Noreen was waiting for the police to arrive, she decided to get ahead of the police and start her own digging. She started calling the rest of the neighborhood. She started calling the families of the other paper boys in the neighborhood to see what information she could find. This is what she was told. Now, right away, she did get confirmation that Johnny had been seen by several other paper boys at the paper drop where they go to pick up their morning papers for that day. Now, he was picking up his load and he was seen by a neighbor and a newspaper boy called Mike. Now, these two people actually saw him talking to a strange man in a blue Ford Fairmont that had Nebraska plates on them. Mike was actually watching from his bedroom window when he saw the car pull up towards Johnny just off the sidewalk where Johnny was walking. Now, even though Mike was watching from his window, his house was still close enough to where Johnny was that he could perfectly see what was going on and he could even hear what was being said. And he said that the strange man in the car had pulled over and asked Johnny for some directions. At first, he said that Johnny completely ignored this strange man. He didn't even stop to look at him. He just kept walking. Then another witness who was also on the street where Johnny was, his name was John Rossi. And like I said, he was on the street and there was a few other kids in the area as well who also saw Johnny talking to the strange man. And the consensus was that this was kind of like an odd situation. It just looked out of the norm to everyone. John Rossi, who was an adult, noticed Johnny turn around, and Johnny actually ended up speaking to John Rossi, telling him that, hey, this guy in the car is asking for directions. Can you please help him out? Because I don't know what he wants. I don't know what directions to give him. But as soon as he says this to John Rossi, the guy in the blue car speeds off, makes a very dramatic U-turn, and just is seen speeding away. So everyone sees this, and Johnny immediately said out loud that he thought this was weird, that he felt uncomfortable, that he thought this was awkward, and that it was kind of freaking him out a little. So he had voiced to everyone that he was just going to go home. So as he was walking home, one of the kids actually followed the blue car and actually saw it stop further down, and it started flashing the car lights 3 times. And that's when he actually saw another mysterious man come out from the bushes in between 2 houses, and he actually started following in the direction of Johnny. The kid who witnessed this said he actually watched the guy make his way from the bushes, cross the street, and started walking towards Johnny out of his way. So it was very obvious that he was actually following and making his way towards Johnny. At the same time, as Johnny was walking in his direction, there were two other newspaper boys walking towards Johnny. So they were essentially just walking towards each other, about to cross each other's paths. They all acknowledge each other, they all say hi to each other, and just continued on as they crossed each other. However, just after they had crossed each other, the two boys were able to hear what was about to happen next. They were able to hear a car come towards the street that Johnny had just turned onto after they had passed. And then they hear the car slam shut, and then they hear the car speeding off, turning a corner, and again running past the stop sign. So immediately they run back to where they had last seen Johnny, and the only thing they found was the red wagon with the newspapers and the little dog tied to it as well. And then the last witness that saw everything go down was a man named PJ Smith, who heard the entire ordeal as well. He heard the car speed off, and he actually described seeing a black and silver Ford Fairmont, meaning that basically at this point there were two different cars and at least three people involved in the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch. So almost an hour goes by after Noreen had called the police, and when they finally arrived to the house, Noreen has a ton of information, a ton of witnesses to give to the police and to share with them so they could immediately start looking for Johnny. But Noreen could tell right away that the police were very uninterested in anything she had to say. They were kind of insisting that this was just a runaway case and that they really didn't see the point in searching for Johnny until at least 72 hours have gone by. Now, Noreen immediately said that this did not make any sense. She completely disagreed with the police, insisting that this was completely out of character for Johnny and that his entire family, including his friends, would all agree that Johnny would just never run away from home, especially abandoning the family pet on a sidewalk like the way he did. So the police leave the house, and I guess they went out to do some investigative work, but they returned 8 hours later to collect some photos and information from Noreen that she initially had when they had first gotten there, which didn't make a lot of sense, and this led people to believe that the police investigation was actually being botched on purpose from the beginning. So during those 8 hours before the police had returned back to Noreen's house, she had actually continued on with her own investigation and started calling back all of the neighbors that had told her they had seen Johnny, just to gather more details and as much information as possible. And she had actually told them that the police had been by, but they seemed uninterested. So when she was speaking to all of these witnesses, they all told her the same thing, and it kind of freaked her out as well. They all told her that the police had come by each of their houses, asked a few questions, seemed to be somewhat interested, but not really. And when all of the witnesses were giving their information, the police just were not taking any notes. It kind of seemed like they were just half-assing it, not really committed to finding what happened to Johnny. So because of the reaction the Gosches had gotten from the police, they decided to take the investigation into their own hands right away and actually started a search party themselves with as many people from the community as possible. As they were searching, they came across a police officer that was visibly intoxicated, and he actually started yelling and almost harassing people that were part of the search party, telling them to go home, that they were just wasting their time because this was simply a case of a runaway. It had become very clear to Noreen and to Johnny's friends and family that the police were basically putting the onus on Noreen to prove that Johnny was just not a runaway, and this completely drove her crazy. I'm sure it would drive any mother crazy. So much so that she just decided to go directly to the media to get as much attention on the situation as possible. And if you look up interviews and if you look up media clips of this time and of the interviews of Noreen, she had a tendency to come off slightly aggressive. Some people were calling her crazy, and the police actually ended up calling her and her husband a bunch of loons. But, being a mother who just had her son kidnapped wasn't going to just stop there and let a bunch of strangers who were calling her crazy stop her from finding her son. So instead, she actually hired her own private investigator. And he quickly discovered some very shocking information. He actually came back and told Noreen that he had found some reliable sources and information that Johnny had actually been kidnapped for these child trafficking rings, and that he was actually being kept alive and tortured and beaten down in order to brainwash him so that he would eventually become a willing slave to his kidnappers. For a little bit, that's where the case stood, and it wasn't until 6 months later that the first sighting came in of Johnny, and it was actually in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A woman was out one day and she was actually approached by a young boy who was screaming, and he was yelling out, "I'm Johnny Gosch, I've been kidnapped." And then immediately come up two men from behind him, grab him, and they put him in the car, take him, and they drive off. Immediately, this woman was completely freaked out, so she goes to the police, she reports it, but the police quickly brushed this off as a family issue and told her to just forget about it, that it was probably nothing, and it was likely that this kid was pretending to be Johnny Gosch for attention. Unfortunately, it wasn't until years later when this woman actually saw a photo of what Johnny Gosch looked like the day he was kidnapped that she was able to confirm that the boy she had seen was actually Johnny Gosch. So for a while, there was no progress until August 12th, 1984, when another paper boy went missing in the same area, and his name was Eugene Martin, and he was only 13 years old. This made Noreen think that these two cases were very similar and that there must have been something deeper going on. And actually later that year, both Johnny and Eugene's photos were the first to ever be placed on milk cartons across America. Now, of course, during this time, the police weren't doing very much, but Noreen was still trying. She was trying her best, and she didn't want to sit there and just do nothing, be a victim, and just feel like she was hopeless in this entire situation. So she actually decided to found the Johnny Gosch Foundation and another program called In Defense of Children that actually focused on finding missing children and increasing awareness for crimes against children as well. And then on July 1st, 1984, she actually managed to even get the Johnny Gosch bill passed in Iowa, which was a law that forces police to immediately investigate missing children instead of waiting 24, 48, or even 72 hours. Because as we know in this community, the most crucial time frame to find a missing child is the first 24 hours. If a child is not found within those 24 hours, the chances of them ever being found, let alone being found alive, decrease by over 50%. So we fast forward to 1985 when the dollar bill clue came in. Now, a dollar bill actually surfaced in a store that actually had some marker writing on it, and it said, "I am alive, I am Johnny Gosch." Unfortunately, that's kind of where this clue died. There was no further investigation that they weren't able to prove whether or not Johnny had actually written this note on the dollar bill. Then in 1986, a third boy actually went missing in Des Moines. His name was Martin Allen, and he was only 13 at the time. Now, he was last seen by his mother as he was leaving the house. He was actually going to go walk to his friend's house, who lived down the street. Sadly, somewhere between exiting his front door and his way to his friend's house, he disappeared and he was never seen again. Then came the letter. It was Valentine's Day in 1988 when the Gosches received a letter postmarked from Idaho, and it was apparently from Johnny himself. In the letter, Johnny actually revealed some very disturbing things that no parent ever wants to hear. He actually claimed that the kidnappers had changed his appearance. They said that he had dyed his hair, that he had been forced to do awful, awful things. He had been given a new name. He also said that he would never be permitted to come home, And at the end of the letter, he actually signed it as "Love your son, Johnny Gosch." Now, Noreen claimed that she knew this letter had to be 100% real because Johnny had a funny way of signing letters ever since he was a child. He would always sign them as "Love your son, Johnny," and this had become kind of like a family inside joke over the years because his family would tease him for signing his letters this way because, it's like "Love your son, Johnny" is not really necessary because his parents know that he is their son. So it had just become like a joke in the family. So she knew that this was a sign that he was sending her to show her that it was definitely him. So if we backtrack a little, there was actually an inmate from the Nebraska Department of Corrections called Paul Bonacci, who in 1991 actually confessed to his role in Johnny's abduction, but police didn't want to entertain his story for multiple reasons, but Noreen did. He actually claimed that he had also been a victim himself, a victim of child trafficking, and as he got older, he also kind of succumbed to his abuse and to the circumstances, which led him to becoming a perpetrator himself. And unfortunately, he also suffered from multiple personality disorder, which was one of the reasons why the police didn't really pay him much attention. He then went on to make some shocking claims, including that there was a ring of child perpetrators in Omaha that were connected to the 3 disappearances. So with this new information, Noreen decided that it was worth looking into some more. So she actually planned a few visits to go visit Paul in jail, where he actually gave her information that no one else would know unless they had known Johnny. He had told her that Johnny had a birthmark on his chest, including several scars across his body that Johnny had gotten as a child. And this was enough for Noreen to believe that he was actually being truthful. As he kept going with this story, it just kept getting crazier and crazier. He stated that there was actually a bunch of traffickers involved, including a man named Emilio. And side note, Emilio actually matched the description. Once police did sketches of Emilio, he actually matched the description that a bunch of the witnesses that saw or that were around the kidnapping of Johnny, they actually ended up matching. But going back, he said that this man named Emilio actually targeted children that he considered to not be used and that were children that were close to their families because he actually enjoyed hurting people. He claimed that him and Emilio were at a hotel together the night before the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch, and there was also another guy named Tony who had brought pictures of local boys, and all 3 of them were deciding on who to kidnap next. And they said they actually had settled on Johnny because he was probably the most likely to bring in the most amount of money. Now, when Paul was actually presented with a bunch of photos of suspects, he actually ended up picking up a photo that shocked a lot of people. And he had picked out a photo of a man who he said he was at the hotel that night, named Sam Soda, and this person was actually one of the private investigators on the team at the time. He claimed that he had been in the car when Johnny actually was kidnapped, and this is exactly what went down according to Paul Bonacci. He said that it was actually Emilio that had followed Johnny, that had come out from between the 2 houses and the bushes, and it actually come up from behind Johnny and scared him and pushed him into the car. It was Paul himself who was actually responsible for holding him down and chloroforming him until he had passed out. And to prove he was actually at the crime scene, he actually went on to draw a map of the streets of how everything went down. And it actually ended up matching the description of all the witnesses. And the cherry on top of all this is that Paul Bonacci actually claimed that he was the one responsible for grooming Johnny in order to make him a better fit for these child trafficking rings. And once Johnny had actually passed out inside the car, they drove to a remote farmhouse in the middle of nowhere where Johnny was actually locked in a windowless room for a week and then after that, he was taken to Colorado. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, because of his mental personality disorder, a lot of people have dismissed him and his claims. However, then came another shocking revelation, and this came in 1992, a year after Paul Bonacci's confession, and it actually came from America's Most Wanted and the host, John Walsh. Now, John Walsh took a lot of interest in this case because it reminded him of his own son. And if you don't know, John Walsh actually was a victim of a similar situation. His son, Adam Walsh, was actually kidnapped and murdered. And if you don't know about the story, I'll link it here up for you guys so you guys can see. I actually did a video about this. It's a very sad story. But because of that, John Walsh dedicated his life to finding as many criminals as possible. And he took an interest in what Paul Bonacci had to say, so much so that he actually interviewed him on an episode of America's Most Wanted. So John and his team go see Paul, and Paul agrees to tell him the entire story and even agreed to take him to some of the locations where he and Johnny were held. So Paul takes them to Buena Vista, Colorado, to an abandoned house where he and all of the other children were kept. And in the episode, I'll put some clips here so you guys can see. In the episode, you can see Paul gets very upset as he steps into the home, and he claimed that him and the other boys were kept in a cellar as slaves. And to prove this, he actually went and showed John Walsh the carvings into the wooden beams across the house, where you can see the initials and names of all the boys that were actually held captive there. Then came another shocking claim, and this time it came from Noreen in 1997. She actually claimed that Johnny came to visit her in the middle of a night, and she actually didn't tell anyone for years out of fear. It was 2:30 in the morning in the middle of the night when she heard some constant knocking at the front door. So she goes and she opens the door, and she sees a young man with very, very familiar eyes. And so she just stares at him until he says, "It's me, Mom, it's Johnny." And to actually prove this to her, he actually showed her the birthmark on his chest, including some of the scars that only he would know and she would know, obviously. She did say, though, that he looked very different from when she had last seen him. He had black shoulder-length hair, he was wearing jeans, a shirt, and a coat. But he wasn't alone. He actually showed up to Noreen's house with another young man. She said that this other man didn't speak very much, but whenever Johnny was talking, he would always turn to him and kind of like ask for a nod of approval before answering any of Noreen's questions. Obviously, being excited that her son was there, Noreen wanted to call the police in order to make sure that he was okay, if there was anything the police could do here, to get information from Johnny to see if they could track down the people that did this to him. But right away, Johnny tells her not to do that because his kidnappers would kill him. He went on to tell her that there were people that kidnapped a lot of kids in the area, and they put them into these rings and forced them to do very awful, disgusting, disturbing things. But when he had gotten older, his kidnappers had actually lost interest in him because he was no longer prime property, or he was no longer valuable to them because he had become too old for him to be abused. So they kind of just tossed him out to fend for himself. She said that they actually spoke for about an hour. And when it came for Johnny to leave, he actually told her that he could not tell her where he was living and that he couldn't actually come home because technically he was still in danger and he was still in fear for his life and the life of his friends and family. So with that, Johnny says goodbye to his mother, and him and the other guy that he came with turn around and just go off into the middle of the night, and that was the last time Noreen ever saw Johnny. Then in 2006 came another disturbing clue, and it was actually pictures that were dropped off in front of Noreen's doorstep, and they were actually photos of several boys all tied up and being gagged. And Noreen was actually a firm believer that one of these boys in the picture was Johnny shortly after he was kidnapped. But that's where the clues kind of dry up. There hasn't been a lot of new official updates or like real clues as to what actually happened to Johnny or where he could be. But that hasn't stopped the internet from creating a lot of theories and doing their own investigations into where Johnny actually is. There's one particular theory, and we'll go into a couple of them here, but there's one particular theory that actually stands out from all the other ones and seems to be very, very popular, and that is the theory of Jeff Gannon. So if you don't know who Jeff Gannon is, Jeff was actually a news reporter that served under the Bush administration. And there was a lot of attention on him right away because a lot of people could not find very much information on him or his background or his credentials. He was actually selected to be one of 30 reporters that get access to the White House and to the president to be able to ask all of these questions. And people were having a really hard time understanding why he was selected, considering that they could not find information on who he was, what his background was, what credentials would give him access to the White House and to the president. So people started digging. They wanted to know who Jeff Gannon was. Not soon after, they found out that he actually had a second name known as James Guckert. And on top of that, they also found something very surprising, that he was actually tied to gay escort services, with him being a gay escort himself. Then people started pointing out some facial similarities to him and Johnny, but it's very hard to tell because Johnny was only 12 years old when he went missing, and today he would be 52. So making the facial comparisons is a little bit difficult. Now, of course, Jeff Gannon heard about all these rumors, and he was actually interviewed quite a number of times about these crazy theories. And he said exactly that. He thought that this was completely insane and that he was willing to do a DNA test to prove, even though he said he shouldn't have to and that he didn't really want to, but he said he would be willing to. And then he also said that he had many people in his life that would vouch for him and would, back up his claims that he was not Johnny whatsoever, including his mother. However, there was attention on Jeff's denial about being Johnny Gosch, and that actually came from a retired FBI agent that was hired by Noreen, and his name was Ted Gunderson, and he was hired to do some more investigative work, and he actually started looking into Gannon as well. He claimed that he had actually come into contact with a source that knew Johnny from the time he was kidnapped and actually managed to stay in contact with Johnny over the years. And it's important, and he actually said that this source was not Paul Bonacci, so it was a different independent source. And he said that this source said that Johnny had changed his appearance quite a lot since he was kidnapped as a child. And he made a shocking claim as well, that he confirmed that Jeff Gannon was actually Johnny Gosch. And a lot of people, point out to the facial similarities. A lot of people also look at the initials, Jeff Gannon, JG, Johnny Gosch, JG. There's a lot of tiny things that are tying these two people together. But Jeff Gannon has remained adamant that he is simply not Johnny Gosch. And I actually came across a Facebook group of Johnny Gosch where Noreen, Johnny's mother, is involved, and she actually made a comment saying that she's convinced that Jeff Gannon is not Johnny as well. So that's the most popular theory, but let's go into a few others that I thought were pretty interesting, especially the last one that I'll talk about. So the second theory is that he was murdered soon after he was kidnapped. The third theory is that he is still alive, but he actually can't come home because he knows too much, which would explain the encounter he had with his mother. And then the fourth and last theory is quite shocking, and it's one that his father could have potentially been involved. Now, like I said, this is all information online. These are all just theories. These are not facts. But the theory goes that Johnny's father was somehow involved based on a few suspicious behaviors, including the strange phone calls that they were getting weeks before Johnny went missing, including the phone call they got the night before Johnny went missing, where his father actually answered the phone. Years later, after Johnny had gone missing, Noreen actually learned from one of her private investigators that the police were told to stand down that morning, which would explain why the police took almost an hour to get to her house, even though the police station was only 10 blocks away. And usually, like I said at the beginning of the video, Johnny's dad always went with Johnny on his paper route. But what are the chances that on the first day that Johnny decides to go without his father, he ends up getting kidnapped? Which led people to pay more attention to something that Paul Bonacci had actually said in one of his interviews. He was asked how he knew, or how the group of men knew, that Johnny was going to be alone that time, considering that Johnny had always gone out to deliver newspapers with his father. And he said that prior arrangements had actually been made with his father the night before, and that it was actually the group of men that had called the family household at 1:30 in the morning that night, giving his father very strict instructions to not go with Johnny the next morning to deliver the newspapers. But why? Why would Johnny's father be involved in something like this? Well, there was speculation that he was involved in these rings, and that came from something that one of Noreen's private investigators found years later, that he would actually frequent a club nearby where a lot of these predators were known for meeting up. But other than that, it's just speculation. There was quite a lot of odd behavior from his father, including him delivering the newspapers after he had found the red wagon. You know, why would he prioritize delivering the newspapers over finding his missing son? But, you know, he has denied any involvement in this. There has never been any concrete information to prove that he was involved. And that's basically where the case is at. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. What do you think happened to Johnny? Do you think that he's still alive? Do you think that he is Jeff Gannon? Have you heard of any other potential strong theories as well that could explain what happened? Do you guys believe Paul Bonacci? Do you think his father was involved? Leave your thoughts below. I'm super interested to see what you guys think about this. It's a very controversial case. I could definitely see that from just all of the articles and the Reddit threads that I was reading. People definitely have their opinions on this case. But other than that, let me know if you guys have any other cases you want me to cover, if you have any other stories, whether they're true crime or paranormal. Leave them in the comments below and I will definitely take a look. All right, thanks guys for joining me on today's video.